I've always been the kind of person who likes doing things alone. Not because I don't like people, but because quiet comes easier that way. A couple of summers ago, I took a long weekend off work and decided to go camping by myself. Nothing extreme. Just a small, familiar stretch of state forest about an hour and a half from where I live. I'd been there before, a few times, and never had any issues. It was late August. Still warm during the day, cooler at night, perfect weather for camping. I left early in the morning, grabbed coffee on the way, and didn't even bother telling many people where I was going. I wasn't planning on being off-grid long, just one night. Maybe two if I felt like it. The trailhead parking lot was mostly empty when I arrived. There were a couple of older cars parked near the far end, but no one else in sight. That didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like a bonus. I locked my car, threw on my pack, and started hiking in. The trail was quiet in that normal, peaceful way forests usually are. Birds whined through the trees, the crunch of dirt under my boots. I remember feeling unusually relaxed, like my head finally had room to breathe. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing just off the main trail. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was obvious people had used it before. Flat ground, a ring of old stones, and enough space to set up my tent. I dropped my pack and started setting up, moving slowly, not in a rush. Everything felt normal, comfortable. I even remember thinking how glad I was that I'd come alone. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that I noticed the first thing that felt off. I was gathering some fallen branches for a small fire when I heard what sounded like footsteps. At first, I didn't think much of it. This wasn't private land. Other hikers could be around. I stood still for a moment, listening, but the sound stopped. No voices, no continued movement. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably an animal, or just my imagination filling in gaps. When you're alone in the woods long enough, every sound starts to feel personal. I finished setting up camp, cooked a simple meal, and lit a small fire as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The forest slowly grew darker, the sounds thinning out until it felt like the world had been turned down a notch. Still, nothing outright scary, just quiet. That changed when I heard footsteps again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Slow, deliberate, definitely human. They weren't coming toward me exactly, more like circling somewhere just beyond the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I could tell whoever it was wasn't far. I stood up and called out a simple, "Hey, someone out there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. I waited, heart beating a little faster than before, then told myself the same thing I had earlier. Maybe another camper keeping their distance. Maybe someone passing through who didn't want to interact. That seemed reasonable enough. I sat back down by the fire, though I didn't feel as relaxed anymore. Every snap of a twig pulled my attention. I kept glancing into the darkness between the trees, trying to catch movement that never quite appeared. At some point, I realized how quiet it had become. No insects, no wind, just the faint crackle of my fire and my own breathing. That's when I saw someone. They were standing just inside the tree line, far enough back that the firelight didn't reach their face. I wouldn't have noticed them at all if they hadn't shifted their weight slightly. Just enough movement to catch my eye. I froze. They didn't say anything, didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stood there. I tried to convince myself I was misreading the situation. Low light plays tricks on your eyes. Shadows look like people all the time. So I stood up and called out again, louder this time, asking if they needed anything. Still nothing. After a few seconds, the figure stepped back, disappearing completely into the darkness. That was when the fear really set in. I remember standing there for a long time, staring at the spot where they'd been. My fire suddenly felt less comforting and more like a spotlight. I didn't sit back down. I didn't eat anymore. I just stood there, listening. Every so often, I thought I heard movement, soft, careful steps. But every time I tried to focus on it, the sound faded. It felt intentional, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of hiking back to my car in total darkness didn't feel safe either. So I told myself I'd wait it out, see if anything else happened. Something did. A little while later, I heard breathing, not mine. It was faint, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere behind me. Close enough that I could tell it was human. I turned slowly, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just trees, darkness, silence. I don't know how long I stood there, barely moving, before I realized I wasn't alone anymore. This time, the person was closer. much closer. They were standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, partially obscured by a tree. I couldn't see their face at all, but I knew they were looking at me. I could feel it in that deep, instinctive way you feel when someone's eyes are on you. Neither of us moved. I felt completely frozen, not brave, not angry, just small. Every thought in my head narrowed down to one simple idea. If I did the wrong thing, something bad would happen. After what felt like forever, they took a slow step backward, then another. Then they were gone again. I didn't wait this time. As soon as I felt like I could move, I grabbed my headlamp and started tearing down my tent as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking so badly I kept dropping things. Every noise felt too loud. Every zipper sounded like it echoed through the trees. I kept expecting someone to rush out of the darkness, to hear footsteps charging toward me. But nothing happened. When I finally had everything packed, I didn't bother putting the fire out properly. I just scattered the embers and started down the trail, moving faster than I probably should have. I didn't run, but I didn't slow down either. The entire hike back felt wrong. The forest felt too still, like it was watching me leave. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, perfectly matching my pace. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. I didn't turn around. When I reached my car, I nearly cried from relief. I threw my pack into the back, got in, and locked the doors immediately. That was when I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. There were fresh scratches along the passenger side door, deep ones, like someone had dragged something sharp across the paint. The door handle was loose, hanging slightly crooked. I sat there for a long time before driving off. The next day, I reported it to the police. They took my statement, asked a few questions, and said it was probably vandalism. No suspects, no follow-up. I never got an explanation for who that person was or what they wanted. I don't know if they followed me from the trailhead or found my campsite later. I don't know how long they'd been watching before I noticed them. I still like being outdoors. I still hike, but I don't camp alone anymore. And every time I'm in the woods and it gets a little too quiet, I remember how it felt to stand there in the firelight, knowing someone was just beyond it, watching me breathe. I've gone back and forth for a long time about whether or not to write this out, not because I think people won't believe me, but because every time I think through it in detail, I notice something new that makes my stomach tighten. This happened years ago, and I still don't have an explanation that makes me comfortable. At the time, I was doing a lot of solo backpacking. Nothing extreme, but enough that I was familiar with the basics and knew my limits. I liked regulated trails and state-managed forests. I wasn't trying to disappear into the wilderness or test myself against nature. I just wanted quiet, long miles, and a sense of being temporarily removed from everything else. This particular trip was in a large state forest with a long, linear trail system. If you hiked the entire thing end to end, it was close to 80 miles. Overnight camping was only allowed at designated sites, and each site had to be reserved in advance. The system was pretty strict about it. The idea was to reduce impact, manage wildlife, and keep a record of who was out there and for how long. I planned a short section hike, 2 nights total. I reserved one campsite roughly 12 miles in, and another about 26 miles from the trailhead. The sites were spaced far apart, sometimes over a mile from the next closest one. It was late fall, technically off-season, which meant fewer people but colder nights. I checked in with the ranger station before heading out, showed my permits, and left my itinerary. I arrived at the trailhead late morning. There were only a couple of cars in the lot, which didn't surprise me. The weather was cool but clear, and the trail conditions were good. I shouldered my pack and started hiking. The first day was uneventful, in the way backpacking usually is. Long stretches of quiet, broken only by the sound of my boots and the wind in the trees. I didn't pass anyone. No hikers, no trail runners, no other backpackers. I remember noticing it, but not feeling uneasy. It was a weekday, and the season alone explained it. I reached my first campsite early in the afternoon. It was exactly what I expected. A cleared area, a fire ring, a bear box, and nothing else. I set up my tent, filtered water, and spent the rest of the afternoon reading and resting. As it got dark, the forest settled into that deep quiet you only get when there's no human activity around. That night, I slept well. I only woke up once, sometime deep into the night. I remember hearing what sounded like footsteps on the trail. slow and steady, not rushing. At the time, my half-awake brain immediately labeled it as another hiker who had gotten a late start. I remember thinking it was odd, checking the time, and seeing it was somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. I fell back asleep almost immediately. In the morning, I didn't give it much thought. I had breakfast, made coffee, packed up, and got back on the trail. The second day's hike was longer and had more elevation gain. It took me deeper into the forest, farther from roads and access points. Once again, I didn't see anyone. By mid-afternoon, I started to notice just how quiet it was. No distant voices, no movement ahead or behind me. Even the usual signs of other hikers, like fresh footprints or disturbed leaves, were minimal. I kept reminding myself that it was off-season and a weekday. Still, the trail felt unused in a way that was hard to describe. I reached my second campsite later than planned. The sun was still up, but it was dropping fast. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and made dinner. By the time I was done eating, it was fully dark. I decided to stay up for a while. I didn't have anywhere to be the next day, and I was enjoying the quiet. The fire was low, just enough to keep warm. That was when I heard footsteps again. This time, I was fully awake. The sound was coming from down the trail, from the direction I had hiked in. Slow, measured. Someone walking with purpose, not stumbling or rushing. A few seconds later, I saw a light, a headlamp, weaving between the trees as it followed the trail. I remember thinking how strange it was. It had been hours since sunset. Anyone hiking that late would have had to start very late, or be moving much slower than average. I also realized that if this was the same person from the night before, I should have passed them during the day. But I hadn't seen anyone. I stood near the fire and watched the light approach. As it got closer, the light suddenly stopped. It didn't turn off. It just stopped moving, angled slightly toward my campsite. It felt like whoever it was had noticed the fire and paused. Then, after a few seconds, the light moved off the trail. It veered into the trees, angling away from my campsite. About 20 seconds later, it shut off completely. No light, no footsteps, just silence. That was the moment I felt genuinely unsettled. If the person had just continued down the trail, I would have written it off as odd but harmless. But stepping off the trail, in the dark, and turning off a headlamp felt deliberate. It felt like they didn't want to be seen. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees where the light had disappeared. Eventually, I told myself a story that made it make sense. Maybe they were behind schedule. Maybe they had a reserved site further up and decided to stop early. Maybe they were trying to be respectful and didn't want to walk past someone else's camp late at night. I went back to the fire. An hour passed. I remember being aware that I was unusually alert. I didn't feel tired at all. It was like my body had decided that sleeping was a bad idea. I kept listening to the forest, noticing every small sound. Then I heard something behind me. It was faint, a single crunch of leaves, very close. Close enough that I felt it more than heard it. The sound of someone placing their foot carefully, trying not to make noise. I stood up and turned around. Nothing. The sound stopped immediately. I reached into my pack and grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees just beyond the edge of my campsite. He was standing there, about 10 yards away, close enough that he had been well within the glow of the firelight before I turned. He wasn't wearing hiking clothes, no backpack, no visible gear, just regular clothes, the kind you'd wear running errands. He didn't move when the light hit him. He didn't raise his hands or step back. He just stood there, like he was hoping I still somehow hadn't noticed him. I said, "What are you doing?" For a split second, he looked like he might run. Then he relaxed and started walking toward me. His face shifted into a smile that didn't match the situation at all. As he got closer, I realized why he looked familiar. I had seen him before, somewhere. I couldn't place it, but I knew I recognized him. Then he said my name. He said it casually, like we were friends who had just run into each other. Hearing my name out there, from someone I had never spoken to, made everything click at once. He said my name again, this time sounding confused, like he didn't understand why I looked scared. I backed up and grabbed my pack. His expression changed immediately. The smile dropped, replaced by something flat and unreadable. He asked what I was doing. I didn't answer. I put my pack on and moved toward the trail. He said my name again, louder this time, the friendliness gone. I heard his footsteps pick up behind me. I ran. I turned off my headlamp and moved as fast as I could, relying on memory and the faint outline of the trail. I could hear him running behind me for a few seconds, then slowing, then stopping altogether. He never left the campsite. I didn't stop walking until dawn. At some point during the night, I used my satellite phone to contact authorities and explain what was happening. A park ranger met me several miles down the trail, near my first campsite. They took it seriously. They searched the area. They checked the trailhead. No one matching his description was found. No vehicle, no reservations, nothing. For him to leave the forest without being seen, he would have had to hike off-trail for miles in the right direction. In terrain like that, without proper gear, it would have been incredibly difficult. They never found him. I still don't know who he was or where I recognized him from. Sometimes I wonder if I'd seen him around town before, or if those moments of familiarity were from him watching me long before the trip. That thought bothers me more than anything else. There's a part of me that hopes he never made it out of those woods. And there's another part that's never quite shaken the feeling that he did. A few years ago, I found myself with more free time than I'd ever had as an adult. I was between jobs, had some savings, and no real obligations tying me down. I didn't want to burn the money on a short trip somewhere expensive, so I decided to rent a camper van and take a longer, slower trip instead. I've never been much of a city person. I like quiet places, trees, open space. I'd always wanted to try camping, but I wasn't confident enough to jump straight into tent camping alone. The van felt like a compromise, still outdoors, but with solid walls and the option to leave if something felt wrong. That detail mattered to me more than I realized at the time. I headed north toward a stretch of national forest land where dispersed camping was allowed. The plan was loose, almost too loose. I figured I'd just drive until I found a good spot. The first couple of nights, I didn't even camp properly. I slept at truck stops, just long enough to rest before continuing. Looking back, I think I was putting off actually committing to being out there alone. By the third day, I was determined to finally camp somewhere real. I was using an app that marked places other people had stayed, little pull-offs and clearings off forest roads. I had a few saved, but none of them worked out. Every time I reached one, there was nothing there. No trail, no clearing, just dense trees and silence. I kept driving farther down this rough, unpaved road, convincing myself the next one would be better. The sun was dropping fast, and I started feeling that low-grade stress you get when you know you're running out of daylight. I also lost cell service, which meant I couldn't even search for alternatives without driving all the way back. Eventually, I noticed a narrow path branching off the main road. It wasn't marked, and it looked worse than anything I'd already driven, but it was the first actual trail I'd seen in over an hour. I figured it had to lead somewhere. I backed up and turned onto it, crawling forward while my headlights cut through the trees. The trail ended abruptly in a small clearing. Barely enough room for the van. No fire pit. No other vehicles. No paths leading anywhere else. Just trees pressing in from all sides. I sat there with the engine running, staring out into the darkness. I felt wrong about it. Not scared exactly. Just deeply uncomfortable. My instinct was telling me this wasn't where I should be, but I was tired, annoyed, and didn't want to backtrack again. I told myself I was just nervous because it was my first time camping alone like this. I shut off the engine and moved into the back of the van. It was already fully dark, so I planned to just sleep and reassess in the morning. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching lightly over dirt and leaves. Before I could even sit up, there was a knock on the driver's side window. I walked up front and saw a man standing there, leaning slightly toward the glass. He smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes and introduced himself. Said his name was Mike. He told me he just wanted to say hello to his neighbor before it got too dark. That immediately struck me as odd. It was already dark, and I couldn't see where he could possibly be camping. There were no lights anywhere, no sound of movement besides him. He kept shifting his weight, glancing past me toward the back of the van, like he was waiting to see someone else appear. It made my skin crawl. I thanked him and said I was settling in for the night. When I stepped back, he didn't move. He just watched me. After closing the curtain, I waited a few seconds and peeked out again. He was gone. I spent the next 20 minutes checking every window, looking for a flashlight, a campfire, anything. There was nothing. The forest was completely dark and still. Part of me wanted to leave, but another part needed to understand where he had gone. I told myself I'd feel safer if I could at least see where he was staying. So I opened the door and stepped outside. The silence was overwhelming. Even the trail I'd driven in on was hard to see. I stood there listening, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me to get back inside. Then I heard a soft, shuffling sound behind me. I moved around the van, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The sound came again, closer this time. I crouched down and looked underneath the van. I saw his eyes staring back at me. I don't remember standing up. I just remember running. I slammed the door shut as he crawled out and rushed toward me. He started pounding on the door, hard enough to shake the van. His face was twisted with something I can only describe as rage, not anger, something more frantic and feral. I started the engine and drove. The trail out felt endless. The van bounced and lurched, and I was terrified of getting stuck or blowing a tire. More than once, I saw him in the headlights, chasing, reaching for the side of the van. Eventually, I hit the main road and didn't stop driving for 2 hours. I ended up in a small town just before sunrise. I didn't sleep that night. I still think about how close I came to staying there, about how easily I could have talked myself into ignoring that first bad feeling. I don't know what that man intended, and I don't want to. I only know that if I hadn't left when I did, I don't believe I would have made it out of those woods. And that's something that's never really left me.